Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Webcast. My name is Christine Jersey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today is Wednesday, May 20th, and we will hear the presentation, Smart Growth and Resilience in Coastal Communities. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen or call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And if it is for a particular speaker, please state so in your question. And we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thank you to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Sustainable Communities Division. To learn more about all of APA's divisions, visit planning.org/divisions, and chapters, visit planning.org/chapters. On your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, please visit our new web address, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So we are moving away from the Utah chapter site and into ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And if you visit the YouTube site, there will be a link there that you can click up at the top of the page to take you to the new site. And if you're interested in proposing a session, you can contact your chapter or division, or you can email Ben Frost at bfrost@nhhfa.org, and that's also up on our website. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, go to your dashboard and select Activities by Provider, and select today's provider, the Sustainable Communities Division, and select today's title. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. For availability of our distance education credits, simply visit our new webpage again, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. We've had some shifts in some of our sessions lately, and the best way for us to communicate with everyone is to let them know through Facebook, so be sure to join us. And lastly, we are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube or visit youtube.com/planning webcast. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will be available at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Okay, so now I am going to turn it over to Jennifer of the Sustainable Communities Division to get us off and running. All right, Jennifer, it's all you.
Great, thanks. My name is Jennifer Koch, and I'm an urban planner with Roadside and Harwell in Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm also the Secretary-Treasurer of the Sustainable Communities Division. And so our division goal is to support planners who are working to integrate all aspects of sustainability into our work, and organizing a series of webinars is one way that we're hoping to share ideas. I'd like to say thanks to all of our sponsors for this year, including Dewberry, Farr Associates, ICLEI, Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, My Sidewalk by MindMixer, Niche Engineering, VHB, WRT, Clarion, and Tesca. So thank you very much. Here's some of our contact info. We have a lot of ongoing initiatives, which you can learn more about on our website and other social media. And if you'd like to sign up for our now award-winning e-bulletin, you can do so on the blog. And feel free to send us any other ideas for webinars or otherwise via the email address here. And we're always looking for more volunteers as well. So for today's webinar, we have, I think, a really great group of speakers. We'll introduce briefly here. So Susan Fox is a project manager and training specialist with the Baldwin Group at the NOAA Coastal Services Center, which is based in Charleston, South Carolina. Susan manages coastal community planning and development training, coordinates smart growth and sustainability projects, and serves as the NOAA liaison to APA and the National States Geographic Information Council. Our second speaker will be Gavin Smith, who is an associate research professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's also the executive director at the UNC Center for the Study of Natural Hazards and Disasters, and the executive director of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Coastal Hazards Center of Excellence. He also advises international, federal, state, and local governments on a number of issues. And our third speaker will be Wendy Goodfriend, who is a senior planner at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. She is an Adapting to Rising Tides program lead and is the project manager for the Adapting to Rising Tides Contra Costa County project. So those are our three speakers, and I'm really excited to hear them speak, and I'm sure you are too, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Jenny. So today we're going to be talking about some smart growth and resilience activities, as well as discussing hazard mitigation. And we're going to hear from Gavin Smith about a case study in Kinston, North Carolina, and also from Wendy Goodfriend about a case study in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then, as Christine mentioned, we'll be opening it up for discussion at the end. So today we just wanted to mention that we know that as more people are moving along the coast and waterfronts, we're faced with the challenge of promoting and providing walkable and compact, economically vibrant communities with a sense of place, and while at the same time ensuring people are safe from hazards. So today we're going to discuss the connections between smart growth and hazard resilience and hear local stories, rural and urban, and how they have addressed or are addressing hazard resilient smart growth. So a little background of why we want to discuss smart growth and resilience. A few years ago, EPA and Rhode Island Sea Grant were delivering smart growth technical assistance to a community in Rhode Island. And while working with the community, they did realize that the smart growth principles didn't address or account for the unique qualities found in the coastal and waterfront areas. And so as a result, these organizations partner with NOAA and also the International City and County Management Association to develop a joint publication titled Smart Growth for Coastal and Waterfront Communities, which was released in 2009. Now, this publication presents the 10 coastal and waterfront smart growth elements that reflect the uniqueness of coastal and waterfront communities. These elements were adapted from the original smart growth principles. This is element number 4. It demonstrates how it is important to create walkable communities, but also that it is important to provide visual and physical access to and along the waterfront for public use. And at the same time we were discussing how coastal and waterfront communities were unique in considering smart growth, there were also discussions among NOAA and other organizations about how these communities are faced with many types of hazards. We thought a lot about how smart growth can help communities become more resilient, such as reducing impacts from storms, erosion, and flooding. So we asked, what does hazard resilient smart growth look like, and how do you implement it? We worked with EPA on identifying these connections, and in 2011 we brought together experts from the fields of smart growth, hazard mitigation, climate change adaptation, and coastal management to share ideas on how communities can achieve smart growth goals while minimizing risks from natural hazards. So for example, if you avoid development in a floodplain by creating an open space for recreation along the water, this open space can also work as a resilience technique because it will help buffer storm impacts. Now, while coastal and waterfront communities are faced with many types of hazards, for today's discussion, we're going to focus primarily on flooding. There are different types of events that cause significant flooding. Some are episodic, such as storm surge, tsunamis. Others are long-term, such as sea level rise. According to the National Climate Assessment, flooding may intensify in many U.S. regions. And some regions are already experiencing large increases in heavy downpours, leading to runoff that exceeds the capacity of storm drains and levees, causing flooding events and accelerated erosion. Sea level rise combined with coastal storms has increased risk of erosion, damage, and flooding for coastal communities. We'd like to know what you are doing concerning resilience and smart growth in your communities. So we're going to be asking a few questions about community planning and hazard mitigation after each presentation. We'll be using a polling software that will allow you to see the answers instantly. The questions we'll be asking are modified from an EPA checklist. It helps communities think through how they're integrating their community planning and flood hazard mitigation strategies in order to improve their resilience. And you can see on the slide here is the website for that checklist if you wanted to go back and take a look at all the questions. And we'll discuss your responses and any of the questions for the speakers at the end of the webinar, as Christine mentioned. So now I'll turn it over to Christine to post our first polling question.
Okay, so the first question is up on the screen now. And we'll just give everyone a moment to answer, and then we'll close it up and we can look at the results. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it up now, and I'll share those results. Okay, Susan, can you see those results?
Yes, I can, thanks. And it looks like we have pretty even between yes, no, and don't know. Yes is about 43%, but I guess the no and don't know are at about 50. Okay, so yes, that's great that some of you are incorporating. About half of you actually are cross-referencing with the local hazard mitigation plan. So that's great. That's great to see.
Okay, we're going to go ahead. We've got one more right now. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that one. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it and share those results.
Wow, okay, so 35% are actually working with these folks to create the comprehensive plan, which is great because it's really important to engage a variety of stakeholders when working on comp plans, making sure that the local government emergency response people are also involved, as well as the public works folks, which we didn't put in this question, but those are also important folks to consider. So this looks good, 37%.
Great. And a comment just came in. I guess it's good to note throughout the rest of these polls. The comment is, those of us who are not public planners or authoring current comprehensive plans as consultants likely compose the don't know category. So just, I guess, keep that in mind as we're looking at these. Thank you for that comment.
Oh, yeah, great. Okay, that's helpful.
Okay, great. So I'm going to close this down and then turn it over to our next speaker, Gavin. Looks great, Gavin.
Okay, let's see.
Can you please go up to display settings for me and hit duplicate slide?
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for inviting me. And in fact, before I get started, I'd be remiss to not mention that that there is a new division within APA that has been formed, the Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Division, and we're really excited about the opportunity to partner with established divisions like the Sustainable Communities Division. So we're really excited about that, and more information to follow on APA's website. So just wanted to share that with folks. So I'm going to be talking about how a particular community, in this case Kinston, has gone about creating a more sustainable and disaster resilient community in a state that's facing not only the dynamism associated with hazards, but for lack of a better way of putting it, a dynamic political climate that includes in some ways a reduced emphasis on awareness of risk, particularly as it relates to a changing climate. And so I'm going to talk about Kinston, but I just think about framing those remarks in that context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hazard mitigation, disaster recovery. I'll talk about barriers to resilience as well as opportunities, the importance of planning. Of course, I'll talk about the case study, and in this case, Kinston has done a really good job of linking sustainability, smart growth, and disaster resilience. And if we have time, I'll talk about the nexus between natural hazards risk management and climate change adaptation. And in fact, much of the material I'll be speaking about today is covered in a text that I had written in 2011 dealing with planning for post-disaster recovery. So some general context, some things that I think are important for all of us to recognize to think through this really complex issue. One is that disasters often expose pre-event conditions that could be problematic or could be used to the benefit of communities. The recognition of the vulnerability of that community, including those that are particularly vulnerable to hazard events, those that are socially vulnerable. Does that community have a planning culture? If it does, has it utilized those techniques to address risk reduction? It's often quite varied. Across the U.S., there's an ongoing challenge as to how do we get land use planners and emergency managers to work better together, this emergency manager-planner divide, if you will, and even the idea of unsustainable development. And very much what Susan was talking about earlier is the idea of developing in a sustainable way should recognize hazard vulnerability. Also, the idea of disasters as opportunity. That's a very common phrase used in the aftermath of an extreme event. I think we need to be really careful about how we use that term opportunity. It can be a chance to incorporate sustainable development and resilience into post-disaster recovery, as well as risk reduction, but it can also, and it can be a way to reduce or improve equity and social justice. The challenge is, in the aftermath of disaster, going back to those pre-event conditions, those in positions of power prior to the event may help or hinder our ability to address those populations that are inherently more vulnerable, but also perhaps maybe less powerful. Planning is key. For example, in the disaster recovery arena, there's a really important temporal dimension. The idea, in fact, Rob Bolshansky has talked about this in the concept of speed versus deliberation. The intense pressure to rebuild communities as quickly as possible versus the willingness and the political will needed to slow down in the aftermath of a disaster and think through what are the best approaches to inject sustainability and resilience. That takes time. It often runs headlong into this this initial idea of the primary metric of success by many communities is the speed with which recovery occurs, not necessarily the degree to which risk reduction, resilience, or sustainability is incorporated into them. Of course, if we did this perfectly, we would be investing more in pre-event planning for post-disaster recovery. The challenge is it may not be as salient to local governments until the disaster actually occurs. And it also is a challenge to change or alter long-standing settlement patterns through land use and incorporation of substantial hazard mitigation. And I'll talk about that in the Kinston case, which they did both pretty successfully. And then the idea of governance and resource distribution. The idea of doing this involves more than planners and emergency managers. It involves nonprofits, it involves corporations, small businesses, quasi-governmental groups, and so on. So this notion of governance is particularly important, and that goes back to the value of planning in the sense of planning as process, and it's important for us to recognize that that takes time as well. Finally, the idea of this hazard mitigation context, thinking about how we maximize the use of existing and emerging policies, programs, and plans. And a few of them are those like local hazard mitigation plans, the emergence of the National Disaster Recovery Framework and local recovery plans that are starting to be developed in earnest, as well as the idea of the still emerging national adaptation policy and the degree to which it is trickling down into state and local government levels, which it varies dramatically right now. And then finally, this notion of local advocacy. Oftentimes, what we found, many of us doing research in this area found that local advocacy is key to affecting significant change. So the notion of disaster resilience, and I'm not going to read through this lengthy definition, which was provided by Dave Gottschalk in 2003, but it does help us understand the breadth of resilience. Not only is it anticipatory, it also involves learning from past experiences. It involves this notion of governance. It includes the idea of not only building strong infrastructure, but also perhaps human settlements that are more flexible and adaptable to a changing environment, in this case, the dynamic nature of natural hazards. Trying to encourage development away from known hazard areas, retrofitting buildings that already exist in these areas, making sure that the natural environment is utilized as best we can to provide absorptive capacity, if you will, in the context of flooding, and then sharing this information with broad-based networks. So some of the barriers to resilience, so that's a broad conceptual definition of resilience, but key barriers to resilience, and this is drawn from Tim Beatley's work, a great book, it's very readable, Planning for Coastal Resilience, written through Island Press by Tim. He talks about a series of issues. One is the idea that communities may not fully recognize the vulnerability of their community. They may or may not be willing to address significant issues down the road, if you will, in the future, taking actions now and making investments now, recognizing that they may bear fruit, if you will, in future losses avoided 10, 15, 20, 30 years in the future. That takes a lot of political will. The idea of local governments often challenged by resources that are limited and other priorities that they may have. That may be schools, infrastructure, and so forth. And how do you encourage communities to recognize that those investments, whatever they are, ought to recognize and ask the question whether they enhance or reduce their resilience to natural hazards and disasters. The idea of planning, if in fact the planning systems are robust or limited, the short decision-making time frames, even issues associated with property rights. And this is an ongoing challenge, and there has been a fair amount of literature written out there that these two do not necessarily run in they're not counter to one another necessarily, but rather that it is within the community's police power to protect property, and one way to do that is in fact limiting development in these hazardous areas. A lot of communities think that the upfront costs are going to unnecessarily hinder their economic development, and I'll talk about that in the context of the Kinston case study. Some ideas that Tim provides to think through overcoming these barriers. The idea of plan integration, which is particularly important, and it was interesting in the poll that talked about the connectivity between comprehensive plans and hazard mitigation plans. That actually is more positive than the results that we found in a 6-year study looking at coastal hazard mitigation plans across the U.S., Gulf Coast, East Coast, and West Coast, as well as the Great Lakes. We found that a lot of hazard mitigation plans actually did not do a good job of utilizing land use planning as a risk reduction measure. And so it's interesting to see the group that's on the call may or may not be representative of this larger national assessment that we've just completed or recently completed. The idea of linking vulnerability into current and future planning and policy is a key way to achieve that end, whether that's through comprehensive planning or actually the adoption of policies that encourage resilience and sustainability. How do local governments make resilience more visible and tangible to, this seems, the term has become very ubiquitous, but if you actually asked individuals about its specificity other than rebounding from an extreme event, they often don't get much farther than that. And I think it's incumbent on us as a profession to think about how do we make this concept not only tangible to people and to understand its complexities, but also make it visible. And whether that's through education and outreach campaigns at the local, state, and federal level, that's perhaps worthy of a topic after the presentation. But also building support for resilience and understanding that it does mean making choices, and that's something that it takes time to get different organizations and communities to recognize the value of resilience, and it may mean altering settlement patterns. It may mean investing or disinvesting in certain areas, and that takes time, and it takes a lot of effort and political capital to make that happen. And then also employing land use tools and community planning techniques, again, that I'll be speaking to in the Kinston case study. So what I want to do is quickly shift to the Kinston case study and think through some of these issues. Just to give you some context, Hurricane Floyd, which struck in 1999, was one of 3 hurricanes that struck the state in a relatively brief time span. It came ashore as a relatively weak hurricane, but it rained profusely. In fact, 25, 30 inches of rain on saturated soil and flooded an area. Almost a third of the state was submerged after that event. So it wasn't the wind, but in this case it was the water and the flooding, not only on the coast, but in particularly riverine communities in eastern North Carolina that were heavily impacted, including Kinston. But one of the things to think about, and going back to this notion of governance, I just wanted to touch on this. One of the things that the state did, and I will say at the time of Hurricane Floyd, I was Assistant Director in North Carolina Emergency Management, and one of the things that we did, and we were adapting on the fly, we didn't have a state recovery plan in place, but we did have a very active governor that worked with our legislature to pull down $836 million of state money to create 22 state programs that didn't exist before the storm struck. A pretty monumental undertaking when you really think about it. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these programs as it relates to Kinston. One of the things we did is we took in essence, ownership of the floodplain mapping program. We remapped our state's floodplains with 2-foot contours, detailed LIDAR utilization, new hydrology in many cases, and in many ways it's considered one of the best programs in the country. Its genesis was after Hurricane Floyd when we set aside $25 million to start that up. We also created a state acquisition relocation fund to bolster the acquisition of low-income properties. This provided up to $75,000 of state money on top of a buyout, if you will, of a flood-prone home. I'll talk about that in a moment as well. We acquired hog farms and junkyards, in essence, inappropriate land uses in the floodplain. We provided a state match to the federal grant programs. So kind of honing in on and moving towards this discussion of Kinston, something else that we did in a pretty significant way after Hurricanes Fran, which struck in 1996, and Floyd in '99. Those are the 2 worst disasters in the history of North Carolina. All told, we acquired approximately 6,000 homes, turned that land into open space. We elevated another 800, working in partnership with FEMA and local governments. We utilized the State Acquisition Relocation Fund because most of the homes we were acquiring were low income, and we used that money to incentivize their participation in the program, with the idea being that if they utilized those funds, they did have to agree to move outside the floodplain, but into a house that was safe and sanitary within the county in which they resided, dealing with the issue of potential loss of tax base. So that's something, again, I'll return to in the context of Kinston. We also acquired wastewater treatment plants like the Kinston treatment plant on the image on the right. It was a $40 million project in and of itself. It was moved to higher ground. We acquired schools and moved them out of the floodplain, other critical facilities. But one of the challenges we faced is that while we did all of these things and we spent massive amounts of federal and state money doing it, the land use integration was highly varied. Some communities were doing large-scale buyouts, but not necessarily altering existing settlement patterns or looking into the future and limiting future development in flood-prone areas. So we still, to this day, do not fully know the benefits of the buyouts, if you will, plus or when you add in the potential risk that may be associated with continued development in and adjacent to those areas. Now, I will say just very quickly, one community that did do a good job of both the project-based experience and land use was Kinston, and I'll talk about that again in a few slides. This is an image of Princeville, North Carolina, and it just goes to the point of the complexity of hazard mitigation choices. If you look at the image, and I'm using my pointer now, this is the levee that protects or protected Princeville here to the right. This is Tarboro. The river overtopped the levee and flooded Princeville, which is the oldest African American community in America, settled by free slaves. They chose to rebuild the levee after Hurricane Floyd instead of taking the buyout and moving to higher ground. And it wasn't surprising necessarily that they wanted to stay there because they were very wedded to that land. The challenge is that they rebuilt the levee. The levee was rebuilt to the 100-year flood. In an era of climate change, whether that levee will be overtopped, I would argue it's probably a matter of time. So when they rebuilt behind the levee, they didn't necessarily incorporate additional risk reduction measures. So they are still at extreme risk. And in fact, today, Princeville is virtually bankrupt, and in terms of its ability to manage its own financial assets is a constant challenge for them. And so this is just an issue of one of the challenges of the choices that communities make to reduce risk. We can understand why they wanted to stay, but we need to recognize the extreme vulnerability they faced. And in fact, by rebuilding the levee, that in essence made them ineligible for a large-scale relocation effort. So focusing in on the Kinston case study is to really talk about several things. One is the large-scale grants management opportunities that were available to them to deal with acquisition and relocation, which was the only technique they chose to employ. They also worked hard to address sustainable recovery, if you will, looking at social, economic, environmental themes. And one of the key elements of their overall planning activities were really focusing on clearing the floodplain. So some of the buyouts in Kinston, if you think about this, in Hurricane Fran in '96, we acquired, working with the community and FEMA, 362 homes. This is a relatively modest, mid-sized, rural, riverine community. We used a variety of funding sources, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HUD funds, as well as the State Acquisition Relocation Program. At this time, the state and FEMA, I would argue, the idea of large-scale acquisition projects were still somewhat new. It took almost a year to develop the application after the event, which was, for those of you that have developed these applications, they're very complex, but it was just, it was eye-opening to many of us that had experienced this for the first time. However, they recognized, and in fact, we ran out of funding when communities started seeing the homes being acquired after Fran. When Floyd struck 3 years later, the city had proactively developed an application in anticipation of a future event. It just so happened that Floyd was even worse than Fran, and the application was submitted and approved 1 week after Hurricane Floyd struck. And so an additional 795 homes are added to the buyout of this jurisdiction. So over 1,000 well over 1,000 homes were being acquired in a mid-sized rural community, which really goes to the issue of the value of pre-event planning, just to point that out. So Kinston looked at really this disaster as a window of opportunity, and I mean that in the most positive way. It wasn't the idea of opportunity for whom that I mentioned earlier, those in positions of power, but rather they really addressed not only the environment, economic development, they also looked at equity in a very thoughtful way. And so prior to the disaster, they had a dilapidated housing stock. They were economically distressed. There was a lack of affordable housing. Skilled labor was at a premium. After Fran, they worked on a number of initiatives, this multi-objective planning idea of clearing the floodplain. They really maximized federal and state grant monies. They utilized local resources that I'll talk about in just a moment. They modified codes, standards, and even altered their investments and future land use planning. And I'll talk about that more specifically in just a moment. And coupled with all of that, they really looked at a comprehensive relocation effort. And by that, I mean that they were acquiring large numbers of contiguous housing or properties as well as infrastructure, and they modified policies that were looking into the future as to where they would invest and invest in areas that were not flood prone. So some of the things that they dealt with dealing with issues like sustainability in the context of social justice and equity, economics, and so forth. They developed an organization called Housing and Employment Leading People to Success, working in partnership with their community college. They were educating and informing people about housing construction, deconstruction, and rehabilitation of homes that weren't being part of the buyout, with this idea of those that were underemployed or unemployed, how they might be able to achieve a meaningful wage. They also developed Call Kinston Home, which was very much focused on revitalization, recognizing that they wanted to revitalize long-standing neighborhoods. In fact, their oldest neighborhoods in many cases were located on higher ground, like is often the case in riverine communities. They also were focused on developing new affordable housing, and the idea of those that were part of the buyout, how could they move them from the floodplain into new homes or existing homes that were for sale in the city center or the town center that were outside the floodplain. Some of the other initiatives that they developed linking hazard mitigation and sustainable recovery, really looking at key plan implementation tools. They looked at a new floodplain engineering study that really helped them to better understand their floodplain, which in many ways, for those of us in planning, would view that as a key element of the fact base of any good plan. They did look at this issue of speed and deliberation in a thoughtful way, because one of the things they did is they stood back and said, we are going to construction in the floodplain until we develop more stringent standards. That takes a lot of political will, and they did that. They ultimately decided that they would no longer rebuild substantially damaged structures in the floodplain. They increased their elevation standards, and they developed expanded floodplain conservation easements, in essence trying to limit or expand the easements of the floodplain, if you will, wherein new construction was not allowed. They also developed a smart growth plan that was underway and under development prior to Hurricane Floyd. It was ultimately adopted 1 month after Hurricane Floyd, and they linked that more quite successfully to disaster recovery funding, of which they received a substantial amount from FEMA and HUD and other organizations. They really focused on, within the smart growth plan, is trying to limit sprawl, if you will. While they weren't growing rapidly, they were concerned about human settlement patterns in the context of the buyouts, and they worked hard to encourage and incentivize those people that were being bought out to move into infill development closer to the city center. They also reused existing structures outside the floodplain, including existing housing, but as well as schools. The image that is shown now is an old school, beautiful old school, that was refurbished and turned into multifamily housing. You may not be able to tell from the image, but it is up on a hill. It slopes down. It is well away from the floodplain, and it's actually a great reuse of the local school. So this is just an image of the smart growth plan, if you will. In yellow is the area where they want to encourage development. The orange, the flood buyout areas, these were some of the most significant buyouts. The gray color, which is kind of an odd color for the floodplain, nevertheless runs through the town, and over time, secondary and long-term growth may be occurring that are numbered number 2 and number 3. But again, trying to encourage infill development, compact urban form, but at the same time reducing flood hazard vulnerability. This is just another example of, and I wouldn't get hung up in the details, but these are a lot of the neighborhoods that they were looking at as part of the acquisition program, and how they might, again, encourage them to move out of the floodplain into a particular selected neighborhood. And they were actually working closely with the real estate community, trying to identify available homes that people that were being acquired or bought out might consider purchasing. And in closing, I've got just 1 or 2 more slides, and just these are some of the the highlights, if you will, of the Kinston case study. In the end, they ended up relocating an estimated 1,750 residents. These are not only individual households, but also rental units and multifamily units, as well as mobile homes and mobile home parks. They worked at replacing a lost tax base via this infill development concept. They looked at creating open space. Much of the buyout area adjacent to the floodplain has been used for greenway development and even canoe access points, and they even considered an educational forest. I don't believe that ultimately was done, but they were looking at multi-uses, non-invasive uses, if you will, in and adjacent to the floodplain. They also removed sewer lines and facilities from the floodplain, the wastewater treatment plant I mentioned, as well as the individual houses and their slabs. And ultimately, because of the buyout of the wastewater treatment plant and a lot of the homes within the floodplain, they significantly improved water quality in the Neuse River. In fact, the wastewater treatment plant was known as routinely flooding and reducing or admitting solid waste into the Neuse River on a fairly regular basis, particularly after heavy rainfalls, and that is no longer the case. So the last slide is to kind of come from the Kinston case and think about it as an example of a community whereby lessons can be drawn from natural hazards planning, both hazard mitigation and disaster recovery, and how they might be used to assist communities address issues of climate change adaptation. And this can be done through the improved use of planning tools and processes that I've talked about, incorporating land use techniques which are very effective but often underutilized, the idea of using planners to build coalitions and span boundaries between planners, emergency managers, and design professionals, for example, even thinking through how we better integrate risk reduction, sustainable development, resilience, and adaptation, and even the idea of planners in the planning process as a way to look at disasters as, particularly disaster recovery, can often be laden with conflict, and so the application of dispute resolution techniques to address issues like post-disaster resource allocation, the idea of altering human settlement patterns and so forth, really is in many ways the domain of the practicing planner. So with that, I will stop. I hope I didn't run over too much, but I will stop at this point.
Okay, thank you. We do have a poll before we move on to Wendy, our next speaker. So I'm going to open this poll up. Okay, it should be up on everyone's screen now.
Let's see, I don't show that up on mine.
It might not show up on yours, but it should show up on everyone else's.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, yeah, I just moved something over.
I'm going to put myself on
Okay,
mute.
Thank you. All right, let's give it one more second before. And Susan, are you there? And can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and then we can take a look at the results. Okay, Susan, do you see those results?
Yes, I do. And Gavin, do you have anything, and what do you think about these results based on your experience?
Well, let's see. You know, I don't know that that's necessarily surprising. It's kind of hard to say the number of people that may have actually been involved in acquisition or buyouts. But the stormwater management side, you know, I don't know. It is a little disconcerting in the sense that there aren't more people that have done that, but it may not be surprising if given some of the results of the research that have been conducted over the years dealing with risk reduction.
Right. Thanks, Christine.
Okay, great. I'm going to then move it over to Wendy.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me. My name is Wendy Goodfriend, and I work at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission in our Adapting to Rising Tides program, and we're the San Francisco Bay Area's coastal management agency. And not with me today, but a key part of this project is Dana Breckwell from the Association of Bay Area Governments Resilience Program. And together the two agencies put together this project that I'm going to present to you, which we've named Stronger Housing, Safer Communities, which is really an assessment of housing and communities in the Bay Area. And the question we often get about this project is why housing and communities? There's a lot of other infrastructure, utilities, other kinds of assets at risk in the Bay Area from flooding or hazards such as earthquakes. And the reason that we focus on housing and communities is because we know that after a disaster, that good, strong recovery is going to rely on people staying in their homes, staying in their neighborhoods, continuing to have those strong connections, using the businesses, getting to their jobs, and having their kids go to the schools in the neighborhood. So if we really want to improve recovery, we need to understand which houses and what housing stock is most at risk, and what are the characteristics of the people that live in those houses. Once we understand that framework, then we can start thinking about strategies that are going to keep people in their homes as we face a major hazard in the Bay Area. This project was collaborative by design. The Adapting to Rising Tides and the Resilience Program at ABAG are both very highly collaborative programs. We had an advisory committee of experts in hazards, housing, and community vulnerability. We worked with them to develop indicators, which I'll show you in a moment, for those three components of the assessment. We also worked with a broad group of Bay Area stakeholders to look at the strategies we developed, how we were presenting the outcomes of the assessment, and really help us think forward on how we can get this information in the hands of those that should be using it. We had a consultant helping us with strategies for future growth, and that was AECOM, which is a worldwide consulting firm with a strong core group in San Francisco that works on sustainability. And this project, we put together a lot of different funding. I work for a state agency. ABAG is a regional agency. We work on grant funds. We had a grant from USGS, from the US EPA Smart Growth Implementation Assistance Program, from FEMA, and then from our own local Strategic Growth Council in California. So for the housing and community vulnerability assessment, we looked at a regional scale. That's all 9 counties in the Bay Area. It's quite a large area. And we wanted to do a screening to understand where there are vulnerable housing and communities living in what you could call high hazard areas. And then we also really wanted to identify what were the consequences of those existing communities and areas that are projected to grow. The Bay Area is intended to take on a large influx of population. So where are they located? And the hazards that we looked at was ground shaking from an earthquake. And for any of you who know seismic and seismic hazards analysis, this was MMI, I think 9 and above. This is not my field. This is where Dana comes into play. We also looked at liquefaction, which is important along the shoreline. And for those of you not in earthquake risky parts of the country, liquefaction is a phenomenon where the ground actually starts to liquefy It happens in the Bay Area a lot around the edge of the shoreline because those areas have been filled and it's kind of submerged bay muds or bay fill. When an earthquake occurs, liquefaction can happen. Those areas become soft, soil strength decreases, and that's what we saw in the Loma Prieta earthquake. A lot of damage from foundations of houses and bridges becoming soft, and then the facilities fail. And then we also looked at current flooding. We had the current 100-year coastal and riverine flood zone, and we're looking at future flooding as sea level rises with 24, 36, and 48 inches. We, using our advisory committee of folks who really know about housing, we looked at fragile housing types. These are the structural housing types that could be damaged if exposed to ground shaking, to liquefaction, or flooding. We ended up having 8 housing types, and I have to say that one of the challenges with understanding fragile housing is the data is not locally available, and so you have to use regional proxies to understand where these types of housing occur on the landscape. We also looked at communities at risk, and we selected 10 community characteristics. There's been a lot of work in the Bay Area looking at equity, social justice, environmental justice. These are 10 characteristics that are often used. We picked these because we felt like they were the characteristics that reflected whether people are going to be able to stay in their homes, are they able to prepare for, respond to, or recover from either a seismic or a flooding hazard. We conducted the assessment at 2 scales. The region is large, as I said, it's 9 counties, and there's a lot of different kinds of communities within the 9 counties and housing types. And so we looked regionally at all 9 counties, and then we zoomed in on a couple focus areas. I think at the moment on our website we have 6 of the community focus areas. They're profiled, they have maps and information about the assessment. We have 10 of them in the works. A couple of them we're still getting vetted through the locals, which helped us look at what kinds of community assets were on the ground. What we found working at these 2 scales is that housing is generally built to life safety standards rather than shelter-in-place standards in the Bay Area. What that means is if an earthquake hits, hopefully you will be safe in your home, but you won't be able to stay in your home. And so if we want to improve recovery, we do need to improve that shelter-in-place standard so that people can stay in their neighborhoods and in their homes. Because we have that liquefaction problem and most single-family homes are not built with a foundation that can withstand liquefaction, it is a challenge for us, and it's a very large mitigation challenge. It's very hard to mitigate home by home for liquefaction. And then in the Bay Area, we don't often see flooding of our residential neighborhoods, and none of the houses, I would say most to none of the houses in the Bay Area can withstand any flooding. There are a couple of places where housing is up on stilts or where they have already seen flooding, and so they have flood proofing, but this is not a condition that we see in the Bay Area. So when we do have flooding, the houses are damaged and not livable. We also found that housing affordability is an existing challenge, and it's going to make recovery more difficult. Now, housing affordability is getting worse in the Bay Area, not better, as some of you may hear. It's on the news. Housing is expensive, and in some of our communities, we have controlled rental housing costs, and so if you are displaced from your rental property, that property could get returned at market rate, which will be much higher than if you lived there for a very long time. And that's going to be very challenging to the renters. There's a large number of renters in the Bay Area. They do not have the ability to improve the resilience of the housing they live in, and therefore, if their housing is not resilient and they're displaced, they're going to have a hard time finding affordable places to live near their jobs, near the services they rely on. And then because we are a very diverse, ethnically and culturally diverse region, we have community members living here that have limited or inadequate information about hazards of any kind. So based on that assessment, we came up with a suite of 40 risk reduction strategies. And the goal is to think about strategies that could help the region meet resilience, sustainability, prosperity, and equity goals. They're focused on housing and the people that live in the houses, the communities that are existing, and then where we are building up new communities. Typically in the Bay Area, we're redeveloping, we're not developing greenfields, and so we're thinking about how we're redeveloping our neighborhoods to be more dense, urban, transit-oriented, but also safe. So we have a couple of different kinds of strategies. We have 3 sort of pools of strategies that we packaged up. We have state-led strategies, and these are important because we need to improve our mapping standards, provide statewide guidance on certain kinds of assessments, and provide statewide education. We have regionally led strategies. The region, the local governments do look to the region, to our two organizations and the other regional agencies to lead the region in trying to solve some of the cross-jurisdictional issues, some of the governance issues. And it is easier for local governments to take action if there's a regional presence promoting that action to be taken. And then there's a large number of locally led strategies for local governments to reduce development in high hazard areas or help retrofit fragile housing, which has been slowly occurring across the Bay Area. And this was the 25th year anniversary of Loma Prieta, the big earthquake, and there's a big push now to keep retrofitting. Improving standards for new construction, and then we really need to move forward on managing our flood hazards more actively and aggressively, as we're going to start to see more flooding as sea level rises. So one of the things that we wanted to do, one of our goals was to really get this information out into the hands of the local governments, the other regional agencies, and people who want to use this, onboard it into their own planning processes, hopefully conduct assessments that tier off of the regional assessment, maybe at the local scale or community scale. And so we built this website. It's hosted on the ABAG Resilience Programs portion of the ABAG website. It's easy to find. If you type in Stronger Housing, Safer Communities, it should pop up. The website address is here, and you should have these slides after the webinar. The website's great. It covers everything that we looked at, the hazards, the housing community vulnerabilities. It has the community profiles. It has access to the strategies, which I'm going to show you in a moment. It has a discussion about financing mechanisms and a table for how to finance some of these strategies. That was very important to the working group and the advisors that were with us. They really wanted us to help support those who want to implement the strategies and funding them. There's a summary report of the project. There's a technical report of the assessment. And then I'm going to show you a little bit about the strategies manual, because this is something that our stakeholders asked us to present to them or provide them is an easy way to get into and look at the strategies. So this is what the strategies manual looks like. It's available on the website. It has this lovely table of contents. You can tell it's intended to be simple, and so that you can walk up to this manual, crack it open, and find the strategies you need. So I'm just going to show you chapter 3 is how to use the strategies. It tells you how you might want to access them, thinking about the hazards, housing, and communities at risk. And then we've presented all of the strategies in these sort of lookup tables that enter through a key consideration. This one is the hazard strategy table, enters their key consideration, talks about the indicators that might be occurring if you're worried about ground shaking or flooding, and then it lists the strategies that you can go look at and consider for yourself. It also has a strategy snapshot, which is sits right before all 40 strategies, because we know that people just want to get a quick look and not have to read through or page through 40 strategies. So this is an example of the state-led strategies with their title and a quick view snapshot. And then it has these 40 strategies, and there's a lot of information. We start with a table that shows sort of the introductory information, so it's sort of an at-a-glance on the strategy. And then it goes into a longer description, talks about implementation and governance challenges, speaks about funding opportunities, and who you'd need to partner with to implement the strategy if you were a different local government or a regional agency. And then it helps you understand what strategies or actions need to be taken before the strategy can be effective. So, as I said, one of the goals was to share the findings with the Bay Area jurisdictions, and we know that oftentimes we can create these lovely documents that no one looks at. So we did decide that we wanted to have this online strategy selection tool. It is very, very simple, but it is a way to get a short list of strategies that might respond to what your concerns are if you're a local government. So what you do is you just click on this quick little tool, and it takes you to a page where you can identify who's the lead. Are you a local government? Are you a regional entity? Are you a state government? You're going to be leading the strategy. You can pick what kind of vulnerability, that's hazard, housing, or community. And then you can pick the individual hazard, or you could pick all hazards. And then you get this nifty-difty little table. It shows you that there's a number of strategies that for local implementation, if you're concerned about community vulnerability and you're worried about any of the hazards, If you click on the PDF for that strategy, and this one is to improve the resilience of rental units, an issue that I brought up earlier, then the strategy will pop up for you and give you the information you need. And if all else fails, our contact information is on the website, and then you just call us and say, help, I can't find anything. And that is the end of my presentation. I do want to encourage people to go use the website and to access it. And I just want to make one last comment that we were just hearing about hazard mitigation planning. Well, the Bay Area is entering into a year-long period of updating our local hazard mitigation plans. Most of the plans need to be updated and complete by 2016. And so we're holding a series of workshops to get the local planners and local governments working on their hazard mitigation plans. For the first time, it will explicitly take into account climate adaptation, so it's resilience and adaptation planning, and we will be using this project, Stronger Housing, Safer Communities, and a number of our other regional projects to support those local governments that are taking on hazard mitigation planning. And with that, I think there is a polling.
Yes.
Questions after me.
Yes, thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get the next poll going. We have 2 more polls here, and then we'll move on back to Susan. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and launch this one. Okay, it's kind of slowing down now. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and then share the results. Okay. And Susan, can you see those results?
Yep, I can see them, and I'd ask, you know, Wendy and Gavin what they think about that.
Okay.
This
Well,
is
this
Gavin.
is Wendy.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Gavin.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in the Delta region, which is up towards Sacramento, they do have a special flood hazard, which is the 200-year floodplain. But beyond that, there's really very few communities around the Bay Area that go up above and beyond the FEMA minimum standards. But I was just at the National Adaptation Forum, and I was hearing a lot from folks from the Midwest, in Ohio, and elsewhere that are going above and beyond. So we're looking to them as others as leaders, and to try to make the case here that we also should be looking above and beyond the special flood hazard standard.
So this is Gavin. Just to maybe add to what Wendy was saying, it's disheartening in some ways, not surprising, and I think that's one of our challenges is to think and recognize that FEMA's 100-year 1% annual chance event should be viewed as the minimum, and also that a lot of these maps are out of date. They're static. They were done based on old data, old techniques, less development, and so forth. And so, almost without exception, not always, but in most cases, they're going to underestimate the risk. That does, not always, but often will. And so, to view that and to make choices about development in and adjacent to the floodplain based on that data is a real problem.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open it up for one more. Okay, I've just launched another question. So if everyone could just please put in your responses. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and show the results, and I invite our speakers to comment on those.
I can just say from the Bay Area perspective, we're starting to see more and more communities around the region as they're updating their general plans, talking about sea level rise and climate change, other climate change impacts. Heat is a big impact for us as well. As communities are updating their community plans here, we call them general plans, most of them are taking these considerations into account. I think the hang up here is that it's hard to open up your comprehensive plan out of the sequence, and some communities don't have the funding to update them every 5 years on the 5-year cycle. The last thing I'll say is that we are revising the statewide general plan guidance, or the comprehensive plan guidance, and that's coming out of the Office for Policy and Research of the Governor's Office, and it will explicitly require them to include climate change in their general plan. So we're looking forward to that. I think it will become easier the more communities that start bringing this perspective to bear. Others can follow in their footsteps. It's more of a resource challenge for us than a lack of interest.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now, I'm just going to close this down and turn it back over to Susan for some closing remarks, and we'll have one more poll, and then we can get to a few questions, hopefully. Susan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm trying to minimize the screen so I can get to my screen. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over a few NOAA resources that can help with communicating and assessing or adapting to hazards. So first I'm going to talk about 2 resources that can help communicate your community's exposure to hazards, possibly to local officials or to the public. The first one that you see here is the Coastal County Snapshot, and it just takes complex data and puts it into visual stories. It's a great communication tool when talking with local officials. We have 3 snapshots for the coastal counties of the U.S. that tie to resilience issues. First, we have the flood exposure snapshot, which shows vulnerable populations and infrastructure in the floodplain. We also have a wetland benefit snapshot, which shows you the economics of benefits of wetlands, also the flood reduction and water quality benefits they provide, and then Ocean and Great Lakes Jobs Snapshot, which shows you the revenue generated through the jobs that are dependent on the oceans and Great Lakes. And first, I'm just going to mention an example that you can see here on your screen, which is from Hancock, Mississippi, and I apologize if it's a little bit small print, but basically wanted to give you an example of how it's been used. The Red Cross used this snapshot, which was the flood exposure snapshot in Mississippi, to kind of help engage residents in the response to recovery and communicate the hazard vulnerability of their area. They were interested in showing the number of elderly residents in the floodplain, as well as the economically disadvantaged population living in the floodplain. And these populations, as you are aware, are of particular interest to the Red Cross, because these residents may require special assistance during hazard events, and all this information provides really important context in planning and recovering efforts. And it's an interesting way to be able to use the snapshot in conversations with the community. If you want to see more examples of that, you can go onto the website to see that. One other snapshot that we have that I was going to bring up is the wetland benefits. This is for Pamlico County, North Carolina. And this just shows you that 52% of Pamlico County is actually in the wetland. And the snapshot demonstrates the benefits of wetlands as wetlands relate to county's economy, reducing flood risk, and improving water quality. There's also a next step section, which is a snippet about encouraging protection of wetlands, so siting development in appropriate places to make communities more resilient. And another tool that really helps communicate exposure to hazards is something that called CanViz. It's a visualization software which is available for free on the Digital Coast website. It's a great tool for communicating exposure. In addition to just looking at exposure to events, you can also look at visual impacts on the landscape of adding a dock or a pier or some type of residential construction project. It's an entry-level program, and it allows users to easily create some photorealistic simulations. We have free trainings and tutorials on the website, so it's something that we'd love for you all to check out. And so just so you know, planning departments have used Canvas to visualize sea level rise, living shorelines, the impacts of docks, and land development options, all different across the country, and those examples are on the website for you to see how other groups have been able to use that information. And so the next thing that we were going to talk about is looking at assessing your hazard impacts, and the Sea Level Rise Viewer is a great resource to visualize and assess how your community could be impacted by inundation hazards. And the purpose of this tool is it really just provides you a preliminary look at sea level rise and coastal flooding. It's really a screening level tool, and it uses nationally consistent data sets. And the maps in the tool, the data and the maps in this tool illustrate the scale of flooding up to 6 feet. So considering how sea level rise can impact the landscape, it can be helpful for communities working toward their smart growth goals to think about this. Flood risk is changing. Dry land today may not be dry land tomorrow. So having an understanding of how the spatial distribution of flood risk could change over time can help communities plan and design for future growth and development to avoid and mitigate risk. And this is just a quick example. This shows you the screen capture of the actual Sea Level Rise Viewer tool zoomed into Tybee Island, Georgia. There are 5 tabs on the top left, and you'll see my mouse go up here. You'll see 5 tabs. And right now we're on the Sea Level Rise tab. And this helps you look at up to 6 feet of sea level rise. It incorporates simulations from Canvas. We won't see this here, but you will see Canvas simulations throughout this tool. And so this shows Tybee at no change. And then if we were to move that scroller bar to 3 feet of sea level rise, you see where it starts to get inundated, and then you move it to 6 feet of sea level rise as we move the slider bar all the way over. And you can see there's a significant impact. The causeway to the island is overflowed, and the island itself is pretty much underwater. So Tybee Island actually has used this Sea Level Rise Viewer and used this information in community groups. And they were able to have the conversation at local meetings and they prioritize an action plan for what they're going to do. So if you want to hear more about that, you can go on our website. And one other point to make is that any of these maps that you find, if you wanted to go zoom into your own area, you can share the map through Facebook or Gmail or Twitter. And so one last tool I'm going to talk about is, green infrastructure. We have green infrastructure as a strategy, as many of you know, to protect communities from hazard events, as well as help them adapt to the rising seas. And I'm going to talk about our green infrastructure training that helps communities understand the different concepts. So NOAA teaches this one-day, full-day, instructor-led classroom course, and it's available upon request if you go onto our website. Participants can learn about a range of natural assets and green infrastructure approaches, and also just understanding that green infrastructure approaches are often used to achieve smart growth goals, as we know, and green infrastructure approaches can provide the multiple benefits, so including water quality, public health, recreation, and increased and improved habitat. And the training covers all of these, but it also talks about how it's used for hazard resilience as well. So just wanted to end with, all of these resources that I showed are on the NOAA's Digital Coast website, and we provide a lot of different data and tools and training and the case studies I mentioned and more. One thing that I'd like to go back to is that Gavin mentioned LIDAR, that he used LIDAR elevation data to help with the remapping of the floodplain in Kinston. We actually provide a lot of LIDAR data on our website, and we have 2 pre-recorded trainings on how to use LIDAR and how to understand it if people are interested in that as well. And those are free on your own time, on-demand trainings. But it's important to know that the majority of the tools that we have focus on coastal. Some of them really are relevant to many of the inland communities as well. So just thinking about planning for resilience to hazard impacts such as inundation can be overwhelming, and we're hoping some of these tools can take some steps to help people protect themselves from some of the future impacts. And just wanted to mention that we have a lot of partners in this process. Really, with APA as one of the organizations part of this Digital Coast Partnership, and through all these partners, they really help NOAA ensure that the resources are useful and used. And with that, I think we'll open it up. I think there's one more question.
Yeah, we have one more poll, and then we can take a few questions. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and everyone can take a look at the results. Okay, do we have any comments from our panelists regarding this poll?
It's nice to see that a third of folks say yes.
This is Gavin. Actually, just a thought is, to be honest with you, not to sound flip, but it really should say 100%, and the reason being is that communities that have developed a hazard mitigation plan are required to do that. So, you know, depending on what the polls tell us, whether the people on the call may or may not have been involved in the development of the hazard mitigation plan, or you know, there may be other ways to get at this. But in theory, if in fact the communities want to be eligible for pre- and post-disaster hazard mitigation funds and most post-disaster assistance provided by FEMA, they would need to have an adopted hazard mitigation plan in place prior to the event.
So this might say that some of them don't currently have that.
It could be, or it could be that they may not be aware that that's a requirement in the hazard mitigation plan, and perhaps they weren't involved in the development of that plan.
Right, right. Kristen, will we lose you?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes,
okay,
yeah.
okay. This first question is for Gavin regarding the buyout program. Why target low-income homes in particular for buyouts? Were there similar guidelines for targeting funding for elevations?
Sure, and in fact, I guess I should have been clear. It wasn't just that low-income housing was acquired. In fact, we acquired houses. In fact, we set a standard, an upper bound of, which it may sound low to most states, many states, but our upper bound for homes that we were buying was $250,000. That said, in Kinston and throughout eastern North Carolina that we bought out, it wasn't focused on low-income housing per se, but in Kinston, like in a lot of communities in the South, a lot of the low-income housing is located in flood-prone riverine areas. Not all, but many were. And so one of the reasons we created the State Acquisition Relocation Fund was to offer additional funds for homes that we were acquiring. I mean, we were acquiring homes for $30,000 that were stick-built. They'd been flooded repeatedly, and they were just very low value. So it wasn't purposefully targeting low income, but rather that one program was meant to incentivize getting people, in this case, low-income individuals out of the floodplain.
Okay. And were any CDBG funds used in relocation?
Right, yes. So the Housing and Urban Development Disaster Recovery, they used to be called Disaster Recovery Initiative funds through HUD. In essence, they were CDBG funds. In fact, one of the things that we did after Floyd that really sped up the process was that we, as a state, made those funds and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds identical, and so in the sense of the criteria associated with their use. And so local governments were not confused by the multitude, or less confused by the multitude of different programs. But we certainly did use what is today referred to as the other types of CDBG funds post-disaster.
Okay, great. This is for any of our speakers. Do any of you have any examples of training available for planners in conflict management to help overcome some of the current political resistance to addressing sea level rise and climate change adaptation?
This Gavin, that's a really interesting question. In fact, so there is a course that I helped develop through the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center that's based at the University of Hawaii, and it is funded through FEMA, and in fact it's focused on disaster recovery planning and advanced strategies for disaster recovery planning, and it does address that. We're actually doing a beta test of that course in June, and it will be available nationwide, I believe, in a month or so after that. So so that course is through the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center.
Okay, any other speakers have comments on that? Okay, this is for Susan. The question is, why is Louisiana omitted from the Digital Coast Sea Level Rise viewer?
That is a great question. Yeah, that's something that we've been working on with Louisiana, with the Coastal Management Program, trying to make sure that all the data is accurate. So that's really, we're just continually working with them to make sure. But yes, that is right. We do not have Louisiana as part of the Sea Level Rise viewer. And it's just for accuracy of data that we're trying to acquire right now.
Okay. Next question. How can communities, this is for anyone, how can communities move forward with addressing the impacts of climate change when people involved in the crafting of the plan do not think climate change exists, let alone is a threat? So this sort of gets back to the political climate that might exist in terms of trying to be proactive about what is occurring. Any other final thoughts on this?
This is Gavin. So a thought is to look at flood hazard risk reduction techniques, and whether you're talking about sea level rise or not, the idea of looking at recognized risk reduction techniques like setbacks off the ocean front, or elevating structures, or limiting critical facilities in areas subject to storm surge. These are, to me, all techniques that certainly are going to have positive impacts in terms of adapting to sea level rise, whether the communities recognize the phenomena itself, it still will play a role in reducing their exposure and ultimately their vulnerability to sea level rise.
Okay, and Gavin, one more question for you. Oh, Susan, did you have a comment?
Well, no, I was just going to agree with Gavin, and I think a lot of times people, when we talk to different communities about this, they just try to not put it in the context of climate change, and it's just all about keeping people out of harm's way, and, you know, reducing economic loss is usually how people try to frame it.
Okay, thank you. This last question here is for Gavin. In terms of the acquisition program, did you have any historic preservation issues involved?
Yes, there were. Using federal dollars, there were extensive reviews, also extensive reviews for elevation of homes. Many of the homes, in fact, we elevated an entire community, Belhaven, North Carolina, that was, it was around at the time of Blackbeard, so it had been around a long time. And so elevating historic properties, acquiring historic properties, we had to work with the State Historic Preservation Office, and in fact, those that are involved in this issue, I would encourage you to think through, and you already are thinking through this issue of coordinating with them to go through the recordation process if in fact you're looking at acquisition, demolition. The other option, of course, is acquisition, relocation, but it still also would have to go through a historic review, particularly if you're using federal dollars.
Okay, great. And there was a question regarding the hazard mitigation and disaster recovery, the division. And yes, I gather you can join now, and they have a page up on APA's website. So if you go to planning.org/divisions/hazard mitigation, you can learn more about that new division and you can join. So
that's right.
A question
Yep.
about
And
that.
so anybody that is interested, I'll make that pitch. I would strongly encourage you to take a look. We'd love to have you on board.
All right, great. Well, that was the end of our questions, and this is perfect timing because it looks like it's just about 2:30 right now. So with that, Jennifer, Susan, Wendy, and Gavin, thank you for joining us today for the Sustainable Communities Division, which is also a fairly new division as well. So thanks to all of you and to our sponsor for joining us today. And again, if you have any other questions, you can email our speakers. We'll have the presentation in the YouTube video up within the next day or so. And please remember that as you continue to register for for our upcoming sessions, to visit our new webpage, which is ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And again, if you go to the normal Utah website, you can see that there's a link there to get you to the new page. So again, thanks everyone, and have a great week.